On April 2nd, 2025, the date Trump administration named Liberation Day, Donald Trump, President of the United States, has announced to the rest of the world that the US would be applying sweeping tariffs on imports from virtually every country around the world. The stated reasons were to protect American workers by bringing the production and manufacturing home, fixing unfair trade due to the deficits that were created between imports and exports, and there was also something about reducing the fentanyl epidemic. We're talking about an average tariff rate of 2.5%, increasing to an average 28% in one of the world's largest importing markets. And at the same time, the world, as well as the US citizens, were told that these tariffs were going to be paid by the foreign businesses, the foreign exporters. And then, in an ironic turn of events, in February 2026, the US Supreme Court ruled the whole thing illegal, forcing the government to essentially refund $166 to $175 billion to importers. So what exactly happened? What was the real plan behind Trump's tariffs? Did any of it work? Did any of it make sense, in fact? And what does this mean for you, whether you are representing a business, whether you are acting as an importer, as an exporter, whether you are a business or a person located inside of the US or outside of the US? How to make sense out of these policies as well as subsequent decisions, and how to make sense out of the repercussions that these decisions have had on the rest of the world's markets and an overall international trade. Today, this video is exactly about that. So let's dive in. Trump trade wars started in his first presidency term when he imposed a 25% tariff on global steel and a 10% tariff on global aluminum, citing national security at the time. Canada and Mexico were initially included, but were then fully exempted by May 2019. Around July 2018, the US then followed to apply 25% tariff on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese import to penalize their intellectual property practices, which frankly was a fair enough decision, because we all have heard of the different stories related to how businesses would pass the intellectual property to the Chinese producers that would then copy those, sometimes redesign the whole product, or even put the very same product for sale a month right before they would need to deliver that same product to their buyers. In the meantime, nothing too eventful took place, apart of course from the pandemic and a couple of wars. But the Biden administration has followed. From January 2021 to May 2024, that maintained those basic tariffs related to the steel, aluminum, and Chinese imports. But they would then escalate those tariffs, putting 100% import tariff on Chinese cars, as well as semiconductors at 50%. Then in April 2025, returning to the office, President Donald Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, short for IEEPA, establishing a 10% universal baseline tariff. At the same time, much higher country-specific tariff rates were simultaneously proposed, but then temporarily suspended to allow bilateral negotiations. So if you well remember, the world went in somewhat of a frenzy, attempting to understand whether this was one of those Trump's statements that had no basis in reality and were primarily serving his own ego in egocentric ways, just to make sure that the world knows how powerful and mighty he is, or whether this was actually a real thing that the businesses would need to essentially deal with, plan for, and account for. On July 30th, 2025, the administration signed the de minimis executive order, entirely eliminating the under $800 duty-free exemption for all countries, effective August 29, 2025. This would mean that international postal shipments would face flat fees of $80, $160, or $200, depending on the country of origin and the assigned tariff bracket. Concurrently, I'm not sure if you remember, a 40% rate was placed on most Brazilian goods because Bolsonaro was imprisoned and Trump sought to penalize the government at the time because he was quite unhappy with a political decision. Those tariffs would then be removed. Then, straight after, July 31st, 2025, the Reciprocal Tariff Executive Order was signed, ending the negotiation grace period which was imposed after April's Liberation Day announcement. This would be effective August 7, 2025, and would say that the baseline 10% tariff remains for the compliant nations that actually took the time to negotiate terms with Trump, while nearly 70 non-compliant nations would face country-specific tariffs ranging from 15 to 41%. China was placed on a separate track, carrying a 20% drug interdiction penalty alongside its reciprocal trade. I'm not sure whether you remember, but at some point China was facing up to 200% in tariff rates, and there was this mutually reassured destruction at that point where Trump would raise its tariffs, then China would respond, then Trump would raise the tariffs again, and this would lead to an application of tariffs of 145% on the US side and 125% on the Chinese side. These tariffs, of course, would not be applied to all the goods. It continues to be work in progress, but it definitely worked to the extent where Chinese and US trade relationship was somewhat severed, and imports from China into the US have decreased dramatically. But this, however, doesn't mean that imports overall from the rest of the world were decreased dramatically, because whatever imports were coming from China to the US were slowly but progressively replaced by imports from countries like Vietnam, for example. And then later on, the US administration would catch up and discover that a lot of Chinese products would be transshipped through Vietnam, and a lot of goods would be declared as having Vietnamese origin, for example, or as simply being exported from Vietnam, where China would not even be appearing in any documentation. And so they've attempted to essentially impose more stringent and more strict origin rules and origin reporting requirements. So then August 6, 2025, the US levies a sudden 25% secondary tariff on India, which was meant to be related to the fact that India was having much closer relations with Russia, buying its oil and gas. And this was meant to be counted as an aggregate tariff load, which was basically a sanction imposed against India, forcing India to renegotiate its terms with the US, which frankly worked, even though that duty was reduced later on. It did make India's oil imports from Russia significantly lower. And in fact, it was the US who started importing more crude oil into India. And then a historic moment comes when February 20th, 2026, in the landmark case Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump, the US Supreme Court ruled that Trump's executive branch overstepped its constitutional limit. The court struck down the IEEPA-based tariffs, ruling that the statutory power to regulate commerce does not grant the president unilateral authority to levy revenue raising taxes without explicit congressional approval. Trump and his lawyers, of course, knew about this, and this is why they have used arguments related to national security concerns, related to either fentanyl or even bringing jobs back, etc. And so this forced the Customs and the Border Protection to stop collections of those taxes imposed by Trump. and essentially start refunding all of those tariffs to the importers of record. You have to give it to Trump. He has quite a lot of fight in him, and on February 23rd, 2026, in an immediate bypass attempt, his administration announced a replacement 10% global tariff utilizing Section 122 of the Trade Act. So May 7th, 2026, the US Court of International Trade also strikes down the administration's backup plan, ruling that the Section 122 baseline tariff is unlawful because the statutory requirement of a nationwide systemic balance of payments, currency emergency is not supported by objective economic data. So as a result of these sequential executive orders, the universal emergency tariffs and the de minimis postal fees enacted in 2025 have been dismantled by the courts. However, let's not forget that the foundational protectionist measures imposed in Trump's first mandate still remain. And these are primarily related to the steel and aluminum tariffs, which were increased to 50%, same as the EU and UK's increases. I actually have a video on this. Please check it out if you would like to learn more about the steel trade around the world. To analyze it all, Trump's administration seemed to rely heavily on the shock value of it all. Obviously, we cannot forget the specifics of his personality, the people he's allied to, his upbringing, but also his business practices. We also don't know what the exact negotiations tackled. All of those countries that actually ended up negotiating with Trump and getting the exclusive lower baseline tariff. UK was one of those countries, incidentally. We, of course, don't know what was discussed during those negotiations. Obviously, as I've already mentioned, a lot of countries didn't even bother to negotiate. But if we consider the global picture of it all, I believe that it would be important to give Trump's administration some grace and attempt to search for a certain method in this madness. Even though all of these measures appear to be extremely chaotic, and businesses do rely on stability for growth and development, especially if they're small and medium businesses. There's a requirement for a certain level of predictability. I think different businesses and different actors that were following the news, they had to deal with the fact that one has to tread carefully and potentially wait for the dust to settle into a more rigid structure of actually applicable taxes and import control measures as origin, for example. But I would like to emphasize one point, which is the foundational assumption repeatedly mentioned by Trump, which was the fact that it would be the foreign businesses, it would be the foreign nations that would pay for the import duties. As a customs professional, I was attempting to find some extremely smart explanation as to why Trump would say something like that. Because in my mind, it would be the importer of record that would pay for the duties. And of course, all of the duties paid are then passed on to the customers. Eventually, it became quite clear to me that Trump's logic would be that if the foreign business wants to sell to America, they would need to foot the bill for the tax collected at the border. This, however, is not necessarily what happens in international supplies, because very often suppliers sell their goods on very specific delivery terms, which means that they don't necessarily foot the bill related to the administrative cost as well as the importation costs into the country of import, but rather they take care of the exportation process as well as the applicable administrative measures. And the maximum they could be capable of is to arrange the transport up to a particular point, after which the importer, which is usually the business established in the country of import, would take care of the remaining processes. Obviously, different businesses are set up differently. There are different kinds of businesses. Some are family owned, some are extremely small, other are medium and have distribution contracts, for example. Other businesses are simple resellers. Other type of business might import very precise, specific parts to further process them to later on potentially export or sell to the US consumer. There are a variety of different business setups that follow after a particular good is imported into the US or any other country for that matter. But when a domestic retailer faces 25% import tariff on specific components or a finished product, they would frequently raise their price tags so that the consumer foots the bill, so they can ensure that their margin remains the same. And mind you, many businesses rely on quite low margins, depending obviously on the product, but I have seen businesses rely on 2% margin. 15% margin would be, I suppose, the most common one, whereas obviously imports from China could face quite a large margin due to the cheapness of the goods imported. But international trade is deeply multifaceted. And depending on the industry, businesses may be forced to react in vastly different ways. For example, in hyper-competitive sectors, US importers and foreign suppliers know that raising prices will drive customers away instantly. And in these scenarios, those suppliers may choose to absorb the tariff themselves or at least attempt to share those costs with the importer. And so the consumer does not suffer as much. And it would mean that both sides, one or the other or both, would have to cut their profits to keep prices relatively steady. And of course, to retain their customer base. A huge part of the business is establishing stable, long-lasting business relationships between suppliers and buyers. And for many small, mid, and even mid to large enterprises, this situation would act as a certain drain, impeding business growth, maybe standing in the way of hiring more personnel, maybe impeding that business of opening an extra warehouse, for example. I'm pretty sure I've heard of different cases where, because of such uncertainty and because the profit margins were quite low on their own, some small to mid companies were unable to continue with their imports and were actually forced to cancel some contract, cancel some orders. Conversely, and without wanting to hate entirely on this logic of protectionism, the pressure often does travel backward across the ocean, because when American companies refuse to swallow the higher costs and they reduce the volumes of their orders or cancel contracts entirely, the foreign manufacturers do suffer as well. Drastic drops in US orders are not that easily replaceable in a short run. And so foreign businesses, foreign suppliers have to enact mitigation measures to deal with the fact that their factory would be producing goods that they cannot sell. And of course, they would need to look for other customers, potentially dump their products on other markets, and this of course creates quite a bit of destabilization. This pressure can force businesses to give in. This is not something that happens forever. Businesses can give in up until a certain point, until they find themselves in a position to look for better solutions, to look for better partners that they can be sure about. Businesses do adapt to pressure to guarantee survival. We can also consider different branches, foreign branches of international businesses established in the US that have their headquarters elsewhere, because different corporations do have massive footprints inside the United States. And somehow I believe that Trump was primarily referring to those businesses when he promised that it would be the foreign countries that would foot the bill, because frankly I do not believe that he was by far and large considering small and medium enterprises. I frankly do not even believe that they are on his radar. He deals primarily with business owners that surround him and whisper in his ear whatever position is more interesting to them in particular, because there are plenty of local manufacturers that continue losing business to Chinese manufacturers and other manufacturers around the world that simply do the job for cheaper. It's as simple as that. They allow for US importers to have bigger margins. But think of international automotive giants, for example, that have manufacturing factories in the US and heavily rely on parts coming from foreign countries. Parts or raw materials, all of it to keep the American lines moving. When a tariff hits, especially as high as this one and completely unexpected, the US based foreign owned factories can find themselves penalized even though they have invested in bringing that manufacturing to the US. And that would force them to navigate alternative routes related to lobbying, for example, other government exemptions, or fundamentally restructuring the way they do business with the US. I mean, when we look at immediate results of these policies, I do not believe they worked as well as Trump may have expected, at least not for the small and medium enterprises. But as I've already mentioned, I do not believe this was the goal at all. I mean, maybe these policies did work for the companies that he was closest to. There are people and companies speculating on whatever Trump administration decisions are. And we have heard of extreme levels of corruption, extreme levels of favoritism. So I do believe that there were quite a lot of winners in this story, but the winners were not the small and medium enterprises or the general household. And I don't believe that the manufacturing in the US has increased because obviously these measures, and I mean, without wanting to be extremely negative about everything, I do believe that protectionist measures can help a country. But of course, my idea of protectionism is not applying a baseline rate to specific countries to see and wait for them to come renegotiate those terms, to come and beg for forgiveness, so to speak. In my mind, protectionist policies need to be extremely well studied, well targeted, and very carefully applied in order to guarantee that foreign partners will still seek the US as a stable, long-term partner that can be relied on. Instead, I think they caused quite a lot of chaos, and they demonstrated to the rest of the world that the US is nobody's friend, that the US will take advantage of its position that was willingly given to it by the rest of the world, but now that the US has all the power and holds all the financial cards and is capable of imposing sanctions, because its financial institutions have infiltrated the majority of countries around the world, it makes the US quite a scary, belligerent, and untrustworthy partner. And of course, in line with all of these different policies, I mean, this was not just a one-off trade tariff policy imposed. Look at the variety of things that the US is doing, like removing its support for scientific investigation or support for developing countries following its Doge endeavors with Elon Musk, while the rest of the world, for example, wishes to move towards more renewable energy. Trump is scaling back, attempting to use more coal, which was the biggest thing in his first term. Now he went after oil, essentially monopolizing what used to be Venezuela, Cuba. Now the Strait of Hormuz is closed. I mean, it's a whole mess. But similarly, I do not believe that it's possible to separate Trump's personality and his business practices in the past from his current political approach to the US government administration. What we see now seems to be quite logically aligned with the patterns that he's demonstrated in the past. I think everybody knows that he has declared bankruptcy about 6 times, but it's extremely interesting how that was done. So what he would do is he would acquire massive properties, predominantly luxury hotels and casinos in Atlantic City. He would use high interest junk bonds and heavy bank loans to do so. When revenue would fail to meet the debt obligations, those hotel and casino businesses would be forced to seek Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to freeze creditor demands. Because the properties that he'd acquired were worth more with his name on them rather than in a forced foreclosure, banks would agree to lower interest rates or forgive his debt entirely. And in exchange, they would get a portion of his equity. So the logic would be that Trump would surrender varying degrees of corporate ownership to the banks and investors. And while his stake at a particular business would shrink with each successive bankruptcy filing, he would still negotiate to keep his name on the building. He would still secure the licensing fees, and most importantly, would protect himself from personal liability and would essentially keep his personal income intact. Based on his patterns, we can, with high confidence, I believe, determine what his high-level strategic style can be and is at the moment. And I strongly believe that it's characterized by high leverage brinkmanship, where he takes his opponents to a metaphorical brink in order to force his opponent to back down and make concessions. He heavily relies on fear and threat of extreme consequences to get what he wants, and this gains him tactical advantage. He also engages in aggressive narrative control, which we see with his lies, constant lies about everything. Everything is great. The good parts of the economy are Trump's economy, the bad parts of the economy are Biden's economy. He also very skillfully exploits the systemic safety nets, and he certainly uses debt as a weapon, knowing that some businesses are too big to fail because there's just too many dependables. There are too many people involved, there are too many structures reliant on that particular system or that particular financial industrial complex. So he does seem to be creating different situations where institutions, whether it be political parties, courts, government branches, must accommodate his demands or risk a mutually assured breakdown. And I do believe this is what happened with the Epstein files. Other administrations were giving us grace by telling us a story that was relatively believable. These stories told by Trump are not believable, and they can be refuted by his own statements. One day he makes one statement, the next day he makes a statement that completely contradicts what was said before. I mean, not to mention the fact that he brings quite a lot of personal into the political. I mean, we see his family making billions out of this presidency. I mean, it's safe to say at this point that the president of the US is for sale to the highest bidder. And he also has quite a high rate of betraying his supposed friends or his allies. I believe this is something that we need to be wary of when it comes to the tech bros that he's allied himself with and has invested so heavily in the AI development and the build-up of all of those data centers that essentially pollute, require a lot of energy, and take everybody's jobs. But if it hits the fan, I do think that he will ditch those as well, even though they provide an enormous autocratic leverage. And also his attempt to get re-elected in 2028 seems to be like a full-in plan at the moment. Many in the US are likely trying to just wait out this period until 2028, where we might have new blood, possibly a Democratic Party, although this is, of course, under question. But the idea is that there will be other US leaders that will likely try to regain friendship with the rest of the world. While I don't think it will be necessarily easy to forget all of the machinations that Trump administration has been capable of, and mind you, the Greenland threats are still flowing around, where a territory grab is something quite new coming from the US towards its main ally. But also, frankly speaking, because the US is acting this way, different countries are looking for partners elsewhere, whether it be business or on a nation-state basis. And so those wheels are turning and some processes are taking place, and it will be very hard to reverse certain contracts and certain agreements that will be concluded in this particular political context. So, to finalize, where it comes to actual customs compliance, businesses that have imported into the US and have acted as importers of record, although of course there are different situations under which a business may have had a representative in the US, and so there's this complex chain of relationships that could be explored for a potential duty recovery. And there has been a boom in third-party recovery mechanisms. So that means that third-party companies and specialized law firms are actively buying the duty liabilities from different businesses, such as transport companies, for example, and then they aggregate those claims and pursue mass refunds through US Customs and Border Protection or trade courts, for example, depending on the complexity, of course. And they do take a percentage of about 15% to 35% as a rate of success. If you as a business need some advice to make sense out of all of this, please do not hesitate in contacting me. I do consult companies more specifically established in the EU and the UK that import into the US and wish to understand how this process works and need some assistance in recovering those unlawfully paid duties. So please do not hesitate in contacting me. I will leave my details in the description box below. Generally, you can contact me on my website, but also leave a comment, leave a like. Please tell me what you think about this whole situation.